Hello, I'm Dan Hamermesh, Network Director of the IZA and the IZA World of Labor. It's a pleasure this morning to have with me Graziella Bertocchi, who is a full professor of economics at the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia, and at least as important, is the president of the Einaudi Institute in Rome, which, from my own experience, I would argue is probably the leading research institute in economics in the country of Italy. So, Graciela, a pleasure to chat with you about slavery and racial inequality. Let me ask you a few questions. Let me start off by asking you how you think colonial slavery, of the kind we certainly had in the U.S. until the 1860s, how does that affect income inequality? And more important, how does it affect, or does it still affect, racial inequality and the racial component of income inequality?
Okay, thank you for having me today. And let me start by saying that indeed, for the US, we do have evidence about a possible link between past slavery and today's inequality, and in particular, racial and educational inequality, because there is empirical evidence both at the county level and at the state level that shows that there is a negative relationship between slavery and today's educational outcomes. At the same time, there has been, over the centuries, a closing of the initial inequality that was there when slavery was abolished, but still we can trace the origin of today's inequality to that historical period. So, for example, I will be brief, of course, but across U.S. state, you observe, take 1940. We have good data after 1940 that we can examine, and the degree of inequality in education, both at high school and bachelor level, between races in 1940 is highly correlated with past slavery, so back to 1865. When you look at what happened after 1940, you see that inequality between blacks and whites, for example, does decrease, but never fades. So it's still persistently there, even if there was an improvement in the situation. So this is how you can connect, the legacy of past slavery to today's performance. And the same can be reproduced at the county level evidence. With the same result. Sometimes when people think about slavery, it is natural to ask if what we observe for the US and we can document for the US is also happening in South America and in Central America, because those were the countries that absorbed the flows of enslaved Africans during the period, the historical period of slavery, and the results are more mixed in South America. For example, in countries that still today have a higher share of black residents, and they are those that absorb the largest share of the slaves, and these are Brazil and Colombia, then you can still see something similar to some extent to what you observe in the US. But much less so in the other countries that have different experiences.
Let me ask you the following, okay? So you say that this was observed in 1940, which is 75 years after the abolition, or 77 years after the abolition of slavery, and it's somewhat less today. That implies that there's been an improvement or a diminution of the effect of slavery on racial inequality. Assume we keep on improving, in quotes, at the same rate for the next 80 years as we have for the last 80 years. Would this effect be gone, or is the rate of improvement so slow as to make it still persistent in 2100?
Well, it is hard to make guesses, but also for this reason, I put together what happened between 1940 and say 2000. These are census data, right? 2000. Soon we will have another wave of census. The decrease has not been uniform, and it didn't happen at the same speed during the period. There was an acceleration of the decrease in inequality in the racial educational attainment, basically during the desegregation years after 1964 and 65, the years of the Voting Acts and other important pieces of legislation. So during the 60s and 70s, there was substantial gain in this dimension. After the 1980s, the situation became more stubbornly persistent in terms of not decreasing further the levels of inequalities. So it's hard to make prediction about the next years because those that we observed in the past were not the same. There were different degrees of closing of the gaps.
Okay, tell me this. This is probably the most depressing conversation I've had in this series, since what you're saying is there's no real evidence that this effect will disappear anytime soon. Is that a correct inference?
Well, it has been decreasing, and if you compare 1940 and 2000, the decrease of the inequality is substantial, but it's still there. It's still there, not in terms only of education, because education inequality in particular is extremely correlated, and this is true all over the world, with income inequality, right? So it would be as hard to predict that there will be disappearance of income inequality at the racial level anytime soon. I think it will be as difficult to answer a question about income inequality because it's highly correlated with educational inequality.
Right. Let me ask you this, okay?
And we don't see any sign of complete disappearance.
Okay.
Perhaps the opposite.
Let me ask you this. We're talking about the impacts of slavery on racial inequality in the Western Hemisphere. And yet, there were countries in Africa, many of which supplied huge numbers of slaves involuntarily to the Western Hemispheres. Other Black African countries, much, much less. Is there any evidence on how these effects on these supplying countries have affected inequality in those countries? Maybe this is research that hasn't been done, but it's sort of the opposite side of the coin.
Yes, it's true. The situation on the other side of the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, is less researched. There has been a very important work by Nathan Nunn and others that has filled the void, but a detailed analysis of the effect of slavery on today's inequality in education within Africa, as far as I know, is not there, right? There are other analyses of the effect of past slavery, of course, viewed from the other side of the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, in Africa. There is Nathan Nunn and others spotted an effect on income level, trust, famously. I did some more work on other aspects that related past slavery, for example, even to the prevalence of HIV infection today through the impact of slavery on family relationship and gender roles. On education, I have not seen some work. Of course, the degree of inequality that we observe in Africa is at the extreme, right? The most unequal country in the world, in fact, is South Africa. It has to be said, however, that within the top 20, say, countries in terms of income inequality in the world today, if you measure it with the Gini, you see half and half African countries and half, again, Latin American or Central American countries. So if you control for income, which is generally a bit higher in South America, South America is competing with Africa in terms of income inequality.
Okay. I mean, the thing is, if I may interrupt, and I think of the African map in places like Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Senegal, Gambia in particular, supplied many more slaves than the East African countries for rather obvious geographical reasons. And I wonder if this might be correlated. I've seen no research on it, but the opposite side of what we're talking about.
Not on education within African countries, as I said, has been analyzed the impact of the outflows of slaves on other dimension, income, as I said, other gender roles, trust, and other outcomes, but not in today's level of education. Some research has been done on South America that, as I said, is competing with Africa in terms of inequality. And in those countries in South America that had slavery in a similar fashion to what we observe, to the fashion that we observe in the US, there is also an association between past slavery and today's racial inequality in education.
Great. Let me change the topic now, and this is maybe even more speculative than the discussion of slavery and inequality in Africa. As I'm sure you know, all people are talking about these days is the COVID-19 crisis. That's all we talk about. Have you gotten the vaccine yet? How are you doing with the lockdowns, et cetera, et cetera? My question on this is there any way you can trace out carryovers of slavery to racial inequality and hence to the burden of the COVID-19 crisis by race in the US, in South America, et cetera? This is highly speculative, I realize, but I want speculation.
Yeah, actually, unfortunately, it's a relatively easy answer because, as I argued at the beginning of this conversation, you can trace today's residual and persistent educational inequality along racial lines in the US to past slavery. And once again, the nexus has been proposed very forcefully, indeed, between today's inequality in education at the racial level and the impact that COVID-19, mainly through school closing, is having or is expected to have on educational attainment in the future. So the same connection with the past and with past slavery, especially that has been searched and found in the data, is making directly the connection with today's inequalities, again at the racial level, in coping in schools with school closure and the other difficulties. I haven't seen academic papers, maybe I've missed some specifically on this, but there is a lot of work, not only in the media, but at the policy level, like Pew as a service on US schools, showing that the most disadvantaged minorities are facing what is called the digital homework gap. So the poorest children, they are often belonging to minorities, are those that have more difficulty. This is not, it's just the top of the iceberg, of course, of all the difficulty that children are having in this moment. The CDC has other research being done on the attitude of racial minority parents. Apparently, they are those that are, despite the fact that they are fully aware of the extra difficulties of their children, despite that, they are more reluctant to send children back to school if compared to white or even Hispanic parents, because they are more concerned about compliance, safety, and dangers, risk that the children would face at school. So they are even more reluctant to send them back if compared to other parents. This actually mirrors what has been discussed also in these days. The minorities are also those that are more reluctant towards vaccination campaigns because of the fear based on past experience of being, at disadvantage also in this dimension. So certainly it is unfortunately easy to expect a worse implications for disadvantaged and minority children of the current impact of COVID on schools.
Let me ask you one final question, probably even more speculative, okay? We spent a lot of time talking about the United States and the Western Hemisphere. And I know Italy never had slavery, at least not de facto. And is there any impact of this historical institution on Italy or on continental Europe in any way that you might speculate about? To me, we talk too much about the US, not enough about other places, and yet there should
I
be
think
an strategy.
I think you have just made a very important point. I mean, of course, Italy and Europe in generally didn't have slavery in the way we've been discussing today. But the issue of ethnic, racial, minority inequalities are not unheard of within Europe. If we think of the UK, even in the face of the reaction to COVID, there has been research done on the so-called BAME components of the UK population, the minorities that have been affected by COVID more harshly. But if we stay within continental Europe, I think that the issue of ethnic and racial reactions to the current public health crisis, to the present and future migration flows, and also in terms of public trust in health authority that we have briefly discussed early, it is an issue that is already here with us. I mean, we already have ethnic and racial inequality. It has penetrated Europe more recently, perhaps, especially for Italy, but it is here to stay. I mean, we have a population that can be is racially differentiated at this point in time. And a problem that I see at the policy level is that decent data that can document these racial and ethnic inequalities, for example, in the face of COVID, but not only that, are currently unavailable. The UK has some data like this, but in the other countries within continental Europe, this issue, which will grow much, much larger in the near future, is actually hard to study because there are no adequate data being collected.
Let me ask one final question, okay? Certainly the rate of infection and death in Italy, Spain, Southern Europe, much higher than it is in Africa. So my question is, have you in the last 9 months seen a reduction in flows of Africans trying to get across the Mediterranean? In other words, illegal immigration, or has this not abated at all?
No, the migration flows actually has been slowing down, and so this has been happening. It is not clear, as it often happens in this case, if it is a result of the health crisis. In part, certainly is, but also it may be the result of the economic crisis, right? Because people that are migrating through Europe through Italy are also typically looking for jobs, and this has not been a good period, of course, to be looking for jobs. So it is hard to disentangle what made this happen, but it certainly has happened.
Okay, that is very interesting.
It has not. The fact that now we have a sort of a pause doesn't mean that this is the end of immigration. Of course, by no means.
I'm sure it's not, seeing as how inequality across the Mediterranean is still incredibly large, and there are tremendous incentives once jobs are created in Italy for Africans to migrate there. I mean, this problem will not go away. But look, Graziella, let me thank you very much. This has been, I really learned something from this more than I often do at this stage. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure for me.